Hi, I'm Allie with the Sacramento History Museum, and thank you for joining us for another Museum Monday. It's a new month, May, so this month we are talking all about redevelopment and architecture here in Old Sacramento. Today we're just going to be focusing on this stretch of building, which might not look that impressive in itself, but it has gone through many owners and many histories. And although today it looks like one large building, there's actually quite a few different buildings. Let's start over on the end with my favorite, the Nathaniel Dingley Coffee and Spice Mill. Now, Mr. Dingley came from Maine to California in 1850. He arrived in San Francisco, and shortly after he came here to Sacramento. His original mill is not believed to be at this location, rather it was likely across the street or possibly even on Front Street. But now it is here at 115 I Street. At the time, the address was 11 I Street. Now, his first building was also built out of wood. That is part of why we don't know where it originally stood. It was built probably in 1850 or 1851. And then in November of 1852, there was a great conflagration throughout all of Sacramento. About 85% of the town was destroyed overnight. At that time, most of the buildings were made out of wood or canvas, very flammable. So he rebuilt at this location out of brick. All right. Now, the bottom level was his storefront. He was both a wholesaler and a retail seller of coffee and different spices that he imported from around the world. The top story was where his family resided. Unfortunately, this building here is still not that 1852 building because he had to deal with two more fires. In 1857, this building lit on fire. It wasn't completely destroyed because of the effort of Mr. Dingley. He was able to run into the fire and the flames using buckets of waters to help put out some of that fire. Although most of his property was lost, he was able to save the building, though he scorched quite a bit of his face in the process. Despite all that heroics and bravery, a year later, in 1858, it caught fire yet again. This time, he had prepared a bit. He had a personal policeman who knew in case of a fire what to do. And so that personal policeman went to the back of this building where there was a stable, and he saved the family's horse first and foremost, making sure it got to a safe location. I assume because that horse was a very valuable part of his business, helping to bring coffee and spices throughout town. Next, he came back to rescue the family, but found that they were trapped. Both of the staircases in the building were engulfed in flames at this point. He desperately searched around for a ladder but could not find any, so eventually the whole family jumped out of the window. At the time, there were only 3 residents there: Mr. Dingley, his first wife, and their son. Mr. Dingley and the boy jumped out first, followed by Mrs. Dingley, who decided to bring a rather large trunk out the window with her in that jump. It hit her on the head as she was coming down, which led to not the most graceful of situations, but she did still survive, and she was able to save $700 in that trunk, as well as some other treasured family items. Whew. Now, after that, they did completely rebuild to this 2-story brick building we see today. This is an original structure in Old Sacramento. It has looked this way for over 150 years. In the 20th century, it was remodeled a bit, but its bones remain the same, so it was easy to return to the way it would look in the 1860s when Nathaniel Dingley was here. Now, as they reconstructed, they also put a basement in. They had their basement to help hold supplies and get deliveries. Still, their bottom floor was their storefront, and then up above, they had their home. If we come to the side real quick, and I'm not sure if we'll actually be able to take a glance at it because I did not realize there was construction. But if you poke just right here, you can see the top of an archway at the bottom of the building. The bricks there are a different shape, and you can see they're a little bit bowed. We believe that used to be a doorway where they actually would deliver different spices to the mill here before they were produced for the public. Now, the reason we still have that here is this building wasn't lifted. Much of Old Sacramento was lifted because there was terrible flooding throughout the 1850s and 60s. And Mr. Dingley owned other buildings in addition to this one. In fact, we're going to head back. Thank you for walking with me. He also owned quite a few buildings on Front Street between I and J, just a stone's throw from where we are now. And those buildings he did lift. He was able to lift them with a hydraulic jack, one that was powered by water. He was able to do this because he had considerable wealth, and also he was very close to both the Sacramento River and the American rivers. Most other buildings here in Sacramento had to be lifted manually by manpower, moving those jacks around, but he had the advantage of hydraulic jacks. I'm not sure why he didn't choose to lift this building, but instead the basement just became their new underground level as the street was lifted up and filled in the space, and that leaves that little architectural remain that we pointed out there. All right, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. There's a lot about Nathaniel Dingley's family to talk about. He, despite being very wealthy and very prominent in the community, had some not so savory history, and he ended up in the newspaper quite a few times. He was in court for one thing or another. An interesting case in 1854, he was being fined for carrying too much gunpowder at his establishment, and he was trying to sue the city to be able to have over 50 pounds of it and to be able to sell it. Why a coffee merchant would need to sell gunpowder is a bit beyond me, and I am a bit curious if that's why he had so many fires in this building in such a short period of time, but he did lose that case. He was also in a pending case where he hired a bodyguard to protect him because he had made so many enemies, and then that bodyguard sued him for not paying him the wage that had been agreed upon for being his bodyguard. He was also divorced twice, went through 3 different wives. His first wife had for quite a while, the one who hit her head with the trunk. Nothing too remarkable about her. The second wife, he did divorce on accusations of adultery. He brought in many, many young men throughout the town who did admit that they had had relations with his wife. The third wife's story didn't end quite as happy as one might hope. She and the bodyguard that I mentioned previously, who wasn't paid properly, didn't get along. And eventually, he ended up getting meaner and meaner to her towards one day when I assume he may have had a bit to drink earlier in the day. She was practicing bicycling in front of the establishment here, and he started yelling vile slurs at her and shooting at her with his revolver as well. She did stay the wife, though, and the bodyguard went away after that. Mr. Dingley himself was also not a perfect gentleman. Probably the most depressing article about him that I could find in the newspaper is when he was arrested for beating his daughter Rosie with a cane. He also pushed her down the stairs and dumped a bucket of slop on top of her head. And the beating was so severe that after that she was never able to live on her own. She always needed the care of someone else. Now, next to the Dingley building is supposedly a reconstruction. But is it completely a reconstruction? So these buildings were never here. These were located on K Street between 2nd and 3rd Street. That's what the big the 54s are gone. There used to be big 54s. All right, just from my angle, I can't see it, but luckily Miss Zoe is helping me. The big 54s there do refer to the address 54 K Street, where this building used to be located. The problem is that is exactly on K Street between 2nd and 3rd Street where Interstate 5 ended up being put in. Everything there was slated to be demolished. But there was particular interest in saving these buildings because they had such a unique railroad history. This is where the offices of the Central Pacific Railroad were held, as you can see on the signage on that section of the building. And so they did agree to reconstruct it here to the likeness that it would have been, and they actually preserved some architectural elements from the original, moved them over here, and used them in the reconstruction. So it's a bit of a hybrid building, some reconstruction, but some actual original elements. Now this used to be 3 totally separate buildings. We'll start on this far end. This was the Stanford building, owned by a man named Hosea Stanford. He owned this 2-story and a rather large building in this green and blue color here. He built it originally first in late 1851, early 1852. We're not sure of the exact date, but he built out of brick from the beginning, which very few Sacramento citizens did. So unlike Mr. Dingley, who had to deal with many fires, when that November 4th Great Conflagration came through, the Stanford building survived. And at the time, on the top floor was the Stanford Hall. This was a community gathering space, and it was one of the only community gathering spaces to survive that conflagration. So after that fire, the Masons and the Oddfellows here in Sacramento started to meet there because there was nowhere else for them to go. The bottom floor was merchant spaces, and then later the top floor, after the Central Pacific Railroad came to be, it was converted into 6 rooms for offices. This middle section of building here, and I'm not talking about the whole thing, just imagine this middle section between these 2 white columns here. This was the original Huntington and Hopkins store, and it started with just Collis P. Huntington, in fact. He started a merchant wholesaler selling miners' goods as well as hardware in 1849. It wasn't until 1855 that Mark Hopkins would join him. Starting in this building, which was 54 K Street, they would stay down below for the merchant space. Up above, Collis Huntington and his wife lived. And then later they bought this building. This was called the Miller Building. It was also built around the same time. So the Huntington and Hopkins building was originally built in that same period as the Stanford building, late 1851, early 1852. It was built of wood, did burn down in that fire, but was quickly rebuilt late 1852 in December. The Miller Building was built in March of 1852, burned down in that fire after only 6 months, again made out of wood, rebuilt in brick in early 1853. It went through quite a few different owners. It was the firm of J.B. Gammons and Company in 1853, the Morgan Miller Company by 1855, and then Marshall Hubbard owned it until 1860. In 1861, Huntington's and Hopkins bought it. They had such a demand for all of their different merchandise that they needed more space, and so they expanded outward, combining these 2 buildings as you see them today. Around 1862, Leland Stanford had taken over from Hosea Stanford, and he was in charge of operating this. He was the one who was essential to the Big Four. It was Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, Collis P. Huntington, and Charles Crocker. And so they built just a little doorway cutting in between their buildings and continued to run as separate buildings for quite some time. In 1878, finally, Leland Stanford did sell his building to Huntington and Hopkins, combining into the space we see today. So that was a lot of information about this giant 82-foot section of land. But it's something interesting to look at an original building in comparison to a reconstructed building. It can be very difficult to tell the difference. Sometimes you'll have to peek at different architectural elements, often seen on the sides or the backs of the buildings, like we pointed out with that doorway. Sometimes you'll want to look at the brickwork on how worn away or degraded it looks, or even how pristine it looks. And then there are many other tactics to help you know what's new, what's original, and what might be something altogether that we will talk about during this month on our Museum Mondays. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you next Museum Monday. We'll be talking about some building deja vu, some buildings in Old Sacramento that look just about the same, and what's up with that. So we hope to have you join us then. Thanks so much, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.